Good morning, followers. Oh, it's been a busy morning already. I'm just getting set up on Instagram Live for today's topic. We're going to unpack a little bit more about attention deficit disorder. I brought this topic up, y'all, if y'all assess me right now, my orientation to time is dwindling. I think it's probably about maybe 2 or 3 talks ago where we talked about the pros and the cons of attention deficit disorder, and there being a lot of benefit for us being, neurodivergent if someone connects with that. Now, this topic gets kind of tricky because what is the blend between attention deficit disorder, regular stress, autism spectrum, and then also just to remind y'all, I sit on the side of what do you do about after you get those diagnoses. So I'm not really going into the diagnostics of that today. If you are one of my clients, that's something that you need to go through with a helping professional. But we're going to talk about some tips and tricks about how do you live and how do you build the lifestyle of recovery, because that's ultimately my wheelhouse. I do diagnose. I am formally trained to do that. But I also realized, within my own journey, the magnitude of being able to work on yourself and be able to recover from a diagnosis. So as I try to multitask, because ADHDers thinks we can do multiple things at once, and I'm not doing well with it, I'm going to go ahead and get this live started on Instagram. So, all the information's out there. We do have attention deficit disorder tends to be an information processing and sensory processing disorder. But I think it's also there's too much information out there in general right now that we're all kind of bombarded. And it's really just a matter of organization. So, and sometimes organization, you kind of have to unpack everything to be able to put it away again. So it can be a whole process in itself, which is why therapy exists. However, it's been my goal professionally to kind of keep mental health as simple as possible, because it can get complex very quickly. Mental health is this lovely brain health, but then also the interconnectedness of the outside and the inside of our world and what influences our brain. But what happens on the inside that also, and it can get complicated very quickly. So that's why I break up these particular topics, because they're a lot to digest, especially when you're learning about yourself. And then on top of that, you're trying to change things, but change is really not that big of a change. If you think about it, it's just making small changes. At least that's what I would recommend. In our life, to be able to overall improve our well-being, to feel better so we can do better. So here are some of the things about attention deficit disorder that I think, the kind of impact before we get to recovery, they kind of, some could call them misconceptions. Some could call them just what you need to understand about yourself and your brain. So we're going to unpack that. Now, and I'm also going to try to keep it short, because these quote unquote lessons, first of all, they're just talks. Hopefully at this point, people, you can gain something from it, but a lot of this is just, taking the time to reflect for yourself about, okay, this is likely what I'm dealing with. This is what attention deficit disorder, how long have I been living with it? Taking the time to understand yourself is the most important part of this, because partly, why do we even get here? So that's my first point, is I want to talk about why do we even get to the point where attention deficit disorder is a thing? And if you've watched my other videos, you guys know I'm big on just the general concept of stress. And as someone who, I was not diagnosed with attention deficit disorder until later on in my adult life. I think I was probably close to 28. I had already had a master's degree. I had already, accomplished a whole lot. But I started looking at my health because if you know my story, I was a lot larger than I am now. I've always been a large person, 6 feet tall, but I was upwards of 400 pounds. And as research has come to to evolve over just my own generation and my own career, because things I learned in school, sometimes they've already updated techniques, approaches, theories to include new things, new modalities. But with attention deficit disorder, what we didn't understand was just the immense correlation with other illnesses, physical health for one, and then just stress and what stress does the body. We always know generally, stress kills. Well, what do you do about that? Like, how do you understand that? And then ultimately, what do you do or can you do to manage the degree of stress and how this all can pile up very quickly? And the first thing is to breathe. But why do we get here? Well, a lot of it is our exposure to stress. And for children, we try to protect our children as much as possible from what stress is. And I think a lot of that actually can cause more stress in the long run, because stress is about knowing you have to deal with stress to be able to learn how to cope with it. So, and there's a good form of stress that we call eustress, EUSTRESS, in my healthcare world. And that's good stress. That's the natural resistance in life that gives us the purpose for coping. And another big reason is, so stress is one, but where does stress come from? And I've found now in not only just research, but that my own career and working with individuals, as well as a reflection on my own experience with attention deficit disorder, is that a lot of the stress that we are exposed to comes from what we're exposed to. So what I mean by that is our parents. Now, if our parents are not great at processing stress, we're naturally any human is going to emit a certain frequency, a certain energy that demonstrates, I'm stressed. Because if you're not intentional and about embracing stress and learning how to regulate it in your life, then you're going to ultimately try to displace it into other places. So where I finally realized, I took this journey into becoming clinical social worker, clinical addiction specialist. I was working with substance abuse clients. And I started just seeing that, after sobriety and my clients were able to get sober, they're now dealing with yet another beast. And that's usually commonly, I want to say diagnosed, but it tends to look like attention deficit disorder. Because after you take away the thing that people cope with, alcohol, drugs, sugar, food, gambling, sex, all of the things that we deal with that can become an addictive nature, you still have to do some healing, not only just to balance the use of this maladaptive coping skill like an alcohol or a drug addiction, but now you have to learn why it's so easy to make those choices. And so I just started realizing, I was like, dang, these people that I'm working with, they think really fast, they act really fast, they have impulse control issues, for the lack of a better term. And then I just kind of continued to see and where along the way I experienced a lot of, what's the word I want to use? Hardships was the word, but so I'll just be honest about it. I experienced losses in my business with clients, whether they would fire me, which is fine because I'm not for everyone. Or I did have a couple of clients who passed away. And so when you don't understand how your brain works, and then you also don't understand how to provide your brain security and your body security, things escalate very quickly. And ultimately, that's what those experiences push me to focus more on process addictions. And so that's why I focus on the relationship with food and recovery, is because once you take away the substance, once you take away the maladaptive coping skill, you're left with trying to understand just the natural thing of your brain that you can't really control. And I'm not going to tell you, my narrative is not about you controlling yourself, but it is about regulating. The only way that you can regulate something is if you seek to understand what's going on and how it works. So there is a lot of information out there for people to do this work on their own, but I also don't think it's organized well to fit in with time passing in people's lives. I think, the type of therapy and the therapeutic coaching that I do is trying to fit in how to make the next best choice to make the choice after that, a little bit easier. And so when I talk about my program, that's what I've been working on behind the scenes. Yes, I am in client sessions a lot of the day. I try to balance my social life and my work life because my own recovery is important and I can't focus. I can go into workaholic mode very quickly. And I have to keep an eye on balancing my own neurochemistry because I too am just as susceptible to leaning into too much, leaning into overindulgence. And even though I found some ways and systems to regulate that with, my movement routine, my relationship with food, there's still times when high stress comes around and that my fast-paced mindset is actually a benefit to me. And you guys can look at that other video, the pros and cons of attention deficit disorder. But there's also the responsibility now to be able to slow down. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience the last couple of weeks because I'm having one of those periods where I had the purpose to speed up and do stressful things, work quickly, think quickly. And the last couple of weeks I've had to really, put on the brakes and fall back a little bit and slow down so I can recalibrate and not just go lean in too fast, too much, and get overwhelmed and then shut down and burn out again. On top of the fact that the seasons are changing, their deadlines and all, I'm like, oh my gosh, I see why people was like, I was there. I still have those times and those moments where I get there as an attention deficit disorder person. So what goes into that stress? Well, a lot of it is the life that we've already built. And I don't expect, and I cannot expect anyone to deconstruct their life in order to just recover. I know I couldn't do it. I had already built a business. I had already designed and gone through really stressful experiences to make the choice of like, you know what, entrepreneurship is for me. Then I've had experiences where entrepreneurship pulls me into a very fast-paced lifestyle and it misaligns me from the things that are important to me and my values that literally ground me into being the entrepreneur that I am. So if I go too fast and I lose touch on those values, then my business suffers. And if I'm not practicing what I preach, what kind of therapist am I? I'm trying to model what mental health and recovery looks like, right? So there is a purpose to being able to kind of go fast, go slow. If you guys want a book, it's kind of hefty. You kind of take it in chunks, but it's called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, where this kind of gives you the neuroscience behind a very fast-paced brain, such as one that has attention deficit disorder. You see a lot of people on the autism spectrum who suffer with this neurodivergent. That's actually an inappropriate thing to say. You don't suffer with neurodivergence, but it can cause them to suffer because if you do not understand the different components to how you work, having a high IQ and being on and being in fast mode all the time is going to lead to other co-occurring issues like addictions, like depression, like other mental health things that take time to be able to regulate again. Okay, so part of the why, we've got stress that's good just in general. We've got stress that is not regulated and not understood how to cope with as things go. And then one of the really more common influences is the things that you honestly couldn't control is being and growing up in a family. Or family system. And that doesn't necessarily mean just biological family. Yes, genetics have something to do with it. But at this point, a lot of the research shows, and there's a Harvard study that just come out in the last few years, that the nature versus nurture argument, it's not really an argument anymore. There's more evidence to suggest that people who are nurtured a certain way have different outcomes when it comes to mental health. And the nature concept is not as strong anymore. And that's also because epigenetics, that the genetic material, yes, can be altered, but the environment can influence. And the environment of nurture and how you were raised, the type of communication patterns that your parents had with you, the type of emotional vulnerability that they showed to you, things called adverse childhood experiences, things happen to you, but the way that your parents and or your support system react to you or to someone who experiences negative events and childhood do influence the way that you can be more emotionally secure. Okay, so one of really that family systems, and this is where my addiction background kind of trained me naturally, is, we're trained to look at the family structure, see what type of relationships That goes into a diagnosis, but it's not a diagnosis. But it's just to get a sense of what you're exposed to. And then understanding what codependence actually means. And this is where my addiction side, where I'm advocating at this point, and I'm going to continue to say it because I've just started to see too many correlations where attention deficit disorder and autism spectrum disorder are an addiction to information, and not knowing what resources and skills that the person holds and needs to develop to be able to organize and process that information. And in recovery, we have a lot of things to learn. So I don't think that that's completely inaccurate. It's just not necessarily being talked about as much. But attention deficit disorder looks very similar to an untreated codependence, unhealthy balance of our interaction within relationships, because we were modeled, that's where I'm getting, we were modeled inappropriate, unhealthy relationship dynamics from previous generations. And ultimately, we're all acting the way that we know how to provide ourselves more security, which is the way that we were modeled, right? So that's a lot of the why, is that when I talk with people who struggle with high intellect, I want to say super low emotional intelligence. Don't think anyone has a complete zero. Even narcissists have emotional intelligence, but they use it as a defense mechanism, and they use it to protect themselves versus to do other things and help and contribute to society. But when I started pulling back the layers of, my clients who struggled with addiction, a lot of them were coming from very similar family dynamics where they were responsible for other people's emotions more than their own. And so a lot of the work that I do with people, whether it's them recovering from an addiction or recovering, trying to work on attention deficit disorder, is that I'm trying to reconnect them with themselves and with their own experiences and with their own emotions, because we literally build life. My whole job is about attending to other people. And so this is why I use my story as a representation, just one story that signifies that I got lost in attending to everyone else. My business is about attending to everyone else. So my transformation, a lot of you are like, oh, did she take a medication? I was on Lexapro for maybe like a year. Other than that, a lot of this was me learning myself and practicing what I preach in terms of looking at my grief and my own personal loss, developing more of a relationship with myself and developing a self-respect so that I didn't completely give all my energy to my clients, to my business in one day, that I'm and I'm binging at night or not having enough energy for myself. And that's if I'm being transparent with y'all, I'm trying to deal with that rebalance right now, because I put it to the test and I made some mistakes and learned life, because I had been successful in one regard and I now have to live with the consequences of that and clean up some of that, but also maintain my recovery. So some of that has shown up in my physical presentation. I know that I have gained weight, even though I have a healthy outlet with the gym. Some of it has been muscle mass gained, but some of it is just straight inflammation and weight gain, because my stress levels, keeping up with them is very challenging. And then when I did make those mistakes in my own application of my life, that I had to slow down. I lost that control, and it working too much, trying to focus on trying to rebuild my business and rebrand myself to make sure that I didn't lose the message that I was trying to make, while also not losing my mental health. And that's been a tough process, and it's not really, can't go in super depth with it, maybe another conversation for another time, but I wanted to stay focused on attention deficit disorder as one of the biggest issues that people struggle with is, how do you set those boundaries between yourself and other people so that you don't lose your energy throughout the day, to where your attention to your recovery and your lifestyle skills get to actually take hold and become protective factors for how you maintain a life that you want. And that's not beating you up and making you think that you're insufficient or you're at a deficit of ability. You are at a deficit of energy, because a lot of this goes into how do you literally manage your money. Financial literacy is another common thing when I see with attention deficit disorder people developing, and I see the early signs of that unhealthy codependence and reliance on something outside of themselves to cope, is that they are spending money because they're just saying yes. Learning that balance between yes and no again will help sustain your ability to say yes. But when you're kind of part of a very fast-paced system in here, as well as a very fast-paced system outside, because the thing is what we're exposed to. Remember, we're exposed to a capitalist society that prioritizes big business being built versus human welfare. And I'm not talking about the welfare system. I'm talking about the average person and how they work within that system. They are told to produce. They're told to, you work 6 to 7 hours a day, you get a 30-minute lunch, or you work 8 hours a day with an hour lunch. And you have to report to everyone when you do that. So that's why a lot of people are seeking, we're going to talk about using political words, seeking asylum from our own big business structures and going to entrepreneurship. And not that I believe in anyone that can do entrepreneurship, but you also have to understand what to prepare for. When you are fully at your own will to build the life that you want, and you've not understood what you're already dealing with, building the system of regulation within your lifestyle can be very challenging. And so that's ultimately what I help people do. I help providers take care of themselves and implement self-care while they also take care of other people. But the business is that other people, right? Your life is your business. So that's a little bit of the why. 20 minutes worth of why, of stress, putting people and other things before us. And that also does include our business, because if you actually have another business in your life and working for an agency and having a stable paycheck is not that's absolutely okay. We also need that in this community, in this country. But if you are not putting, if you are putting your business first before your health, it's not going to be sustainable. I think plenty of people can be successful with it. We see that everywhere, but it probably won't be sustainable. And you'll either, want to give up, or you will just get more frustrated at the amount of time that it takes to actually build business. I frustrate myself every darn day that I could be this, I could be that. But again, I've just talked about in, the last 20 minutes of taking it slow so you can sustain and build the systems to be able to support a long-term success that does keep on and giving to you, right? And so that takes time and thought to be able to be okay, well, what is it that you're going for? And I think a lot of people, they have systems that work for them. They may have partners that allow someone to be very all in and focused versus balancing presence within the family structure, but that's not everyone. So I'm trying to speak to the people who don't have that, and they still have to understand particularly how they work so they can get work done. All right, so I'm just going to go into one kind of tip, because we're kind of talking and circulating about it right now, which is how do you build the lifestyle? And I saw this, and this is why I think I have to kind of generally speak right now, because during COVID, a lot of people were unprepared, myself included, to transition home and work in a either hybrid schedule, but at COVID at that point in time, it was pretty much all the schedule. We didn't really know if we were going back to work or anything like that. And then some people chose, myself, I chose to stay virtual because it allowed me the freedom to align with my values, and for me to be able to, if I needed to go help my mom out with something, that I could take a client on the go, not necessarily while driving, but I could go down to my mom's house, hook up to her Wi-Fi and work there versus having to only see people in an office, right? So that's where I chose to do that. However, I had already been working on that lifestyle, and I understood boundaries is really the biggest issue for a lot of people during that time when we transitioned back home, is understanding how your brain actually comprehends regulation. And so this is going to be a common thing for people when is understanding what boundaries, the different types of boundaries. And I think a lot of, and partly why I don't talk about boundaries is because this is a very individual, person-centered discussion, because boundaries look different for every person. But there's also a lot of misconceptions that boundaries are control factors versus regulatory factors. Boundaries are things that they will get crossed. They will teach you, the individual, as well as someone else, about how to deal with a situation. They're like standard operating procedures, but guess what? If you break an SOP and you work for an organization, that's a different, yes, you get a consequence. If you break a boundary or you cross a boundary, there is a consequence. However, you get to choose whether or not how that consequence gets carried out. And this also gets very serious very quickly, because then you start to have extreme boundary violations, like people getting assaulted and SA'd and all that. Those extreme situations make a conversation about healthy boundaries very difficult. But that is a huge component, because just to kind of give you, and this is information that you can find out there, and you can also find it in my app as well, but understanding the different types of boundaries, and then also the mindfulness component of how do you conceptualize boundaries, because they don't visibly exist, especially the ones that are in your head. And those are the ones that we tend to, when we're dealing with attention deficit disorder, intellectual boundaries, emotional boundaries tend to be the things that are underdeveloped, because we grew up with either a parent or in situations where we prioritized other people's needs over our own emotions. So ultimately, we turned off, metaphorically speaking, the switch to emotional and intellectual boundaries in our own brains, because we grew up in environments where it was kind of forced upon us. It's a little bit more covert of a dynamic in a situation, so it's a little bit harder to conceptualize. And the way that we do that, we call ourselves people pleasers. We call ourselves lovers. We call ourselves empaths. And I know I'm empathetic. I know, and that's not going to change, but it can change if I don't protect it and I don't regulate it. Because it's not that I don't care when I say no, it's that I have to make a decision sometimes, especially if I've let it a situation go on too far, where saying no has to be something that's kind of difficult. And then now we're talking about, well, what's your reaction? We're talking about emotional issues of are you conditioned to react when you do hard things? Because doing hard things usually provokes stress and fear, specifically for people, and having to choose courage when you're experiencing that. So that regulation, and this is where a lot of the behavioral and reconditioning has to happen for our emotional stress and being able to implement a new scary situation, right? So that's one of the biggest things about attention deficit disorder, and we talk about recovery that gets overlooked, is that you can learn. Attention deficit disorder is not just and even a learning disability is not a learning inability. It is a deficit, and likely is because you didn't have a scenario to understand your own brain to be able to learn in a way that you actually retain the information. Because there's also things going on outside of you. There's teachers that don't want to, have the patience to try to figure out one person's problem to, the 15 other kids in the class, and they just become, the person that, like, oh, I have a learning disability, stuff like that. So it does take time. Recovery takes time, and it takes effort to learn, okay, this is what I do. This is how I typically operate. And here is the point, and I'm figuratively pointing at a place of transition, because we make natural choices where our brain is just going too fast and in a way of being efficient, because we've not actually accommodated the things that don't make sense to us, and that usually tends to be emotions. So I started, and boundaries are what help what help people regulate those emotions, not control them, not shut them down, not bottle them up anymore, but actually recognize like, oh, I can feel this fear coming up. And then I was doing it this morning. I was experiencing some anxiety and some fear about a decision that I have to make. And I found myself on Instagram scrolling, and I'm like, I'm supposed to finish. I have a deadline today. I was like, I am supposed to finish this before I go live. And I found I was on Instagram. And so my brain, because naturally dopamine feels better when I am scared, that I go on Instagram to relieve it, and then I catch it and I'm like, okay, back to it. I don't get lost in the sauce. I don't beat myself up anymore for being like, oh, I'm on Instagram, I got distracted again. I don't just throw up my hands and surrender to the negative aspect of it. I see it, I course correct. And if I have to do that 18 times a day, I'm gonna do it 18 times a day. Because at this point, I mean, and that's also without medication, mind you. That was my personal choice not to be on medication, but it's because I use my relationship with food, and I take, actually, no, I don't really take any supplements. I take my electrolytes, I eat healthier foods. It helps slow and put less stress on my body, so my attention is a little bit more clear. On top of that, the weightlifting also helps regulate hormones. So then that way, as a female, I don't have, every 28 days, something that comes in and knocks me off my course of action again. It's going to happen at first. It happened to me, and it happens to a lot of other people. But there are things, and that's where therapy can also help retrain and relearn how to manage those things if you're struggling with them. Because attention deficit disorder, especially for women, can be challenging to keep up with. Just because of the amount of fluctuation, not only emotionally, but then hormonally, that influences emotion. And then on top of being in just kind of unhealthy circumstances half the time as well. So of course, my attention deficit disorder, now that I've figured it out a little bit, I have made an acronym. And I made another acronym for attention deficit disorder in my first ADD video, so you guys can go back and listen to that one. But this one, when we talk about how do you know when you're stuck, or how do you know there's something that could help you recover your mindset, recover your attention to an issue? And that's the word fine. Oh, it's fine. How are you today? Oh, I'm fine. How are you? As a therapist, it's kind of an inside joke with my clients at this point. I put a little bit of pressure on them to pay attention to this word, because as therapists, what I'm notoriously known for is, oh, you try to help people. Well, yeah, I either take people's kids away, which I don't do. That's if I tell people I'm a social worker. Or as a therapist, they're like, oh, you're all about feelings. Yes, we are. They're a very big component in the human existence. And so the word fine, when I say trigger, I don't mean like it's a negative trigger. It just is attunes to my ear to be like, what's fine? What's fine? So FINE. So whenever you hear yourself, using fine, now not all the time, but I would just challenge you to just investigate a little bit more. The acronym is forgot I need to exist. And I find a lot of the times that people, it's kind of normalized. They're coming in from, big groups of, being and working with colleagues, and you don't really go beneath the surface. You don't really get to know yourself a whole lot from those environments. So the word fine is just kind of an automatic response. And it's my job to be like, let's pause for a moment. What is fine? Like, because that doesn't tell me much. And so that's where I get the notorious, stereotype of like talking about people's feelings all the time, because yeah, I do have to get people to check in with themselves, and I typically am the prompt for that. So I am bringing this here to the general public about when you find yourself saying fine, consider do I need to exist in this moment? So forgot I need to exist is really just prompting the question, do I need to have an experience in this particular circumstance? Am I existent, and am I accommodating for myself and validating that existence or that experience? And because a lot of the times, this is where attention deficit disorder people, now if you're also not prepared to manage acknowledging your existence and the emotions, especially if it is a negative emotion, then there's another component. You also just have to retrain yourself to breathe and regulate and be a little bit more tolerant to your emotions and the discomfort. And then figuring out, I have another acronym as well that's based in fear, which I'll maybe talk about as one of my, basically, I won't do it right now. Let me stay on fine. ADD moment, I'll be like, detour or stay. We're going to stay on course and just talk about fine. So if you acknowledge that you have an existence that is getting overlooked, and they're usually not very chaotic circumstances. They're usually just moments where you can start to like, actually, you know what? I'm fine, but what I am actually, it's kind of heavy today. I was stressed out earlier today and I'm kind of still feeling it. And hopefully, and this is also, you have to kind of be mindful of who you do this with. You do it a little bit over time, you start to learn who actually can hold that space for you. So being a provider of in a support system for someone with mental illness is very, in my previous talks I've had with the internet, is a matter of how do you hold space. So that holding space requires us to be okay with our own emotions. So we don't necessarily try to deflect or dismiss anyone else's emotions or someone who is expressing themselves to us. And all they really just need to do is express it. They don't need to, they don't need you to fix it. They don't need you to provide a recommendation unless you ask them first. You just need to be able to hold the space. So if someone does really actually express themselves or tell you their existence, that, you'll probably be caught off guard at first and be like, oh, dang, someone actually answered how they truly were. I see that look on people's faces all the time where I'm like, I'm overall good, but it's been a tough day actually. And they're like, okay, well, good. And I'm like, I don't take it personally anymore because that just shows me that, like, okay, I don't know if someone's the wrong person to open up to until I open up to them. And I don't put out that much because I can be a very highly sensitive person. I am a very highly sensitive person when it comes to other people's energy and emotion. And until I learned how to regulate that and did my own work, did it actually kind of work against me? Okay, so this is where self-care, I like to compound interest. You do a little bit now, the long term, you will have built up enough energy to be able to hold space for people, to be able to be less reactive, and learning the process of acknowledging what your emotions are, what your feelings are about something, and not being quick to react or quick to not react. Because I actually end up dealing with a lot more clients who are conditioned not to react than they are to overreact, if that makes sense. And this has just a lot to do with, I think, just probably the fact that we tend to create businesses where we are selling to former versions of ourselves, right? So I ultimately am working with people who I know can relate to my story enough where they can start to relate to their own stories, and they are struggling with something very similar to me. And I was an emotional repressor. I would just bottle up, eat to try to get my brain back online versus actually be like, you know what? This has been a really challenging week. I'm going to actually give you all an example because my attention deficit symptoms have been kind of resurfacing recently because I'm going into a new phase of my life while also carrying the baggage of, the last, 7 years of the work that I've done on myself, the business that I've built, still trying to do a lot of work, but then also trying new things. And that's scary. I, did one of my first training, so that's where I read a comment. Thanks, kid, for actually, acknowledging that. And, but I've been seeing some more of my symptoms come back with I've been making a couple of mistakes with my schedule. Your relationship with time, especially for an ADHDer, is critical. Because we spend so much time up here going over and over and over again that we lose our sense of what time actually is. And it's technically just the perception of the speed that we're thinking. So when I started realizing that, okay, I'm making some mistakes, I'm doing this, I can hear my internalized perfectionism go on off. And so those negative kind of belief systems that I did correct, I recovered from earlier on in my journey, they're still there though. And I got to make sure I pick those weeds just as quick so they don't grow and they don't fester and tear down everything that I've created in here to be able to help regulate my attention and my focus. Because those emotions, that's an existence, it's an experience of human nature. Unfortunately, we can't just vomit them out and just be done with emotions. They are literally what have built this great society that we have, although flawed. And it's going to be also too, once we start integrating emotion and actually embracing vulnerability and emotional vulnerability into our narratives, into our leadership structures, then we will be able to kind of course correct, I think, from a lot of the flaws that we're seeing in today's time. ADHDers in their relationship with time. Yes. Okay. Well, maybe that will be my part 3, will just be how does the relationship with time and ADHDers really kind of manifest. I go over that in my program and in my group, but that's why I try to bring topics out just kind of in very small doses to be able to kind of give them to the general public, just to kind of like, hey, start working on this. But time blocking and time budgeting can be very challenging. And there's a lot of good AI programs that can help ADHDers, but I don't recommend going straight to those because they can be quite overwhelming when you still have to set up those times. But I'm getting off on a tangent very quickly because one person asked a question, is a great question. So maybe I'll bring that back up to part 3 after the tips and tricks. So really the first tip is you have to include your experience fine. Anytime you hear yourself use the word fine, just be like, am I fine? Do I have an experience? What's going on here? And if you and emotions don't have really the best of relationships right now, that's okay. The biggest thing is just be intentional about your breathing and bring it back down, because emotion is just the energy that you produce by experiencing life. Okay. It is literally what propels you. But if it's a big emotion for you and you're still not quite equipped to cope with that, breathing and then also talking to someone that you maybe have a trusted relationship with can also help you kind of reduce the influence of how that emotion is going to bias the rest of your day, maybe a situation that you're in. If you don't have a person around, and this I know can sometimes be quite overwhelming for people, but just writing down and journaling, like, okay, this is some BS. I'm feeling really freaking uncomfortable, and just getting out the consequence of that emotion influences thoughts, it influences old traumas. Sometimes it can trigger those things. And then just to be able to try to ground yourself as much as possible. And also another trick too is these short breaks. So for attention deficit disorders, this kind of goes in with the time situation as well. But you can kind of regulate your attention because we get to in hyper focus so quickly. Being able to break those things up into smaller chunks is very helpful to try to course correct to your natural neural pathway that's very fast. So if you have a big emotion that comes up because you do take a look at your experience, then breaking away from what you're doing for like 2 to 3 minutes. I typically tell people to go to a different environment. So like step outside. You don't have to go for a huge long walk. You literally just have to change and get your brain to realize we're not in that same situation anymore. This emotion does not have the same place. And then you can regulate there versus trying to be like, standing here, multitasking, okay, I'm really kind of scared right now, and trying to push through it. Because then that's actually kind of really neutralizing the impact of the boundary that you're trying to set with your emotions and your intellect at that point. So there's a lot of tips, I think, in there, but let's just recap. FINE, the acronym is forgot I need to experience, or forgot I need to exist. I kind of just made this up, honestly, this week with like one of my clients who is notoriously resistant to talking about their feelings. And I'm like, how did you exist this week? Like, and then it hit me and I was like, I knew I wanted to come up with an acronym for FINE and how it relates to people who just, attention deficit disorder is not necessarily their diagnosis, but who just are naturally resistant to emotions. So you can create it your own, but that's ultimately how I challenge my clients to be like, okay, how did you exist? Not how do you feel? Because if you ask me that question as a therapist, I'll be like, I feel annoyed by that question. I don't want to feel all the time, which I think is quite ironic because I'm a therapist. I deal with people's emotions for a living, and I had to learn my own, and that's ultimately what really set my own transformation of my life apart from what I was doing in the first part of my career. So, fine, forgot I need to exist. We talked a little bit about that boundaries. It takes time for a new system to kind of update. So right now you are updating basically and creating a new neural pathway in your brain to remind your high, fast-paced efficiency mindset to do one thing and to pause and be like, oh, maybe I'm tethered to this emotion and I just need to like not drag it along with me and actually just include it and be able to go this different way. And then you can regulate a little bit more and be able to not be as held back and repress your emotions. For work that doesn't fire my narrative, I've recently started each time 35 minutes that has one. Yeah, no, I love the curiosity that you have to your own like path and pattern, because that's ultimately what I end up doing as a coach and a therapist for people is I'm just observing their patterns. And if we can kind of disrupt the pattern in a small enough way, and your brain is like, oh, well, that's not as smooth as it used to be, and you can kind of find your own new way, then it kind of challenges your brain to be like, okay, well, maybe we need to slow down so I can do this a little bit more, right? And that slowing down is a big part of it. But I know for my own self, I had to slow down. I definitely still do way too much. I try to be very mindful of how many tabs I literally keep open on my computer, because a lot of that is a manifestation of how much I've got going on in my mind. I have notes upon Post-it notes that if I have a thought, and sometimes it's annoying that I write things down and then I can't remember or find the note, but it's somewhere. It's either, and then I also try to, I'm probably in a transition period right now because I actually ended my work notebook, where I write down and I can kind of go back and recall like, okay, I know I had this thought, so many times, or so many months ago. Let me go back. Did we actually end up completing it? And then I can refer to one place versus I'm trying to get out of Post-it Central because that's just chaos. And then I trigger my own self. So hopefully that was helpful for y'all. So it's the biggest tip right now is please include your own existence. When you have attention deficit disorder, you are fast thinkers, you're high-powered thinkers, you're very creative people, usually for other people. And being able to reserve some of that for yourself, a little change will go a long way. And just to remind y'all, I'm a harm reduction therapist. I focus on like better outcomes and not just completely cold turkeying and restriction everything. And then if you want to learn some more deeper understandings of yourself, I have my self-guided therapeutic coaching program where it's essentially like, if you've never gone to therapy before, it could help understand the different psychoeducation parts of therapy. And then also it's geared towards your relationship with food, because for a lot of ADHDers, food is a problem. And a lot of hunger cues are missed. You're not eating the right amounts of nutrition for your brain to be able to make changes. And that's where you see a lot more, stuff happen. So that is out for you guys to be able to be curious about. And if you're interested in that, but yeah, the next talk will probably go more into another tip time. Thank you. Because I'm at the point where I need some ideas. I have so much stuff in my brain that I can talk about that perpetuates my ADD. And I've been able to like get it out over the last year. But I need some prompts. I'm like, what do you guys want me to talk about in terms of a mental health recovery therapist and addiction therapist? Self-guided what? So it is a self-guided therapeutic coaching program. If you guys go on my website, let me change my caption here. Get my website. Is that, so my website's kind of just a landing ground for, my story. Of course, the standard website. But then Right Size Perspective is about rebalancing your mental health through the relationship with food. And so really the common denominator in most addiction recovery, whether that be substance addiction and or process addiction, is that people are imbalanced internally, but part of that internal imbalance is also your relationship with yourself and your emotions. So I've put together a course-like program, but it's also designed to be a longer term program because, hey, we all live really busy lives. And so like going back to school is really difficult, even though people do it all the time. This program is kind of to be a kind of a school of you, and to be able to secure that time to prioritize your self-care, learning about yourself, and re-establishing a relationship with food that will help your brain health and overall your success in being sustainable with prioritizing mental health in your lifestyle. So hopefully, self-guided therapeutic coach. That's what I'm calling it. It's called Fresh Perspective if you want to know the actual name of it, but the description of it is that. But for Fresh Perspective, yes, now, and I'm looking for, I have a live component to that particular group, but that is female only at this point in time. Once I get the self-guided group going, and that does come with a supplemental coach that helps reinforce the breathing techniques and the regulation. Where was I going with that? Self-guided program, once I get that secured and fastened a little bit more, then I will be opening a men's group, the live component of Fresh Perspective, where we go over the different kind of each topic of each session of the course, and we go into more depth and kind of unpack and break it open a little bit more for understanding, and then ultimately come up with and build a community for people who are doing the work on themselves over time and facilitating their own healing. So that's what Fresh Perspective, Right Size Perspective, Perspective Counseling. I've gone through so many different names, but it's really Perspective Counseling. Right Size Perspective is that relationship with food and yourself, and developing an understanding of your emotions. And then see if you need a space like therapy. But I was trying to bridge the gap of like new therapists are coming out. They need to learn. There's a shortage of therapists. There's people who need to heal and who need to understand yourself. And you take your time with it. So this is what I've been working on behind the scenes for a long time. Honestly, we're probably like 4 years. I first launched the first Fresh Perspective program at the beginning of COVID. And it was an online program. It was only live. There was no course. And then got distracted with my own business ventures. And then now I'm back for, I don't know what round. I guess this is round 2, but it's constantly kind of being evolved and not changing too much, because it's just my version of what I think is important for people to understand about the non-negotiables of what therapy offers. But you don't necessarily need a therapist. I'll be here to guide you, but you don't need a therapist that's going to sit down with you and like pull things out if you are willing to do your own reflection in the process. So because I need to shut up now and go do my administrative work, that's where I'm going to leave it. I will come back probably in about 2 weeks. Maybe I might do 1 week again, but I'm kind of on a 2-week rotation just because I had a very busy summer and I'm still just trying to figure things out. And we'll probably open up the relationship with time and correlation with attention deficit disorder. So you guys have a great evening, a great Friday, and a great weekend. I see clients this weekend, so it's going to be working, but I'm excited to talk more about this. And if you guys have any questions, please leave comments below. You can go over to my YouTube as well and watch some of my older videos. And I hope you guys have a good weekend.